I'm the director of the Center on Disability and Inclusion and the Inclusion and Communication Initiatives at Syracuse University. I'm also a professor of inclusive education and disability studies and the coordinator of programs leading to teacher certification in inclusive special ed. I have been working with individuals that type to communicate in the Syracuse area and around the world for over 20 years through research, training, and technical assistance. And I have learned so much from the typers, family members, communication partners that I've worked with during my time here. But before I came to SU, I was a teacher, the special education half of co-taught teaching teams. And I had the great fortune to work in a district committed to the full inclusion of all students, including those considered to have complex support needs and those that didn't rely on verbal speech to communicate. And while I had the passion for ensuring full and meaningful academic and social access, I lacked the tools and training to fully realize that vision. Presuming competence is a necessary but not sufficient component of good teaching. That assumption of possibility must be paired with the tools, strategies, and technologies necessary for all students to truly show what they know. I know that in my early days of teaching, I was really focused on making sure students were included, sometimes so focused on that I didn't always make sure they were truly learning and had ways to make that understanding and their ideas available to others. It was by getting to know typers and really listening to what worked for them that I started to reimagine the role of the educator in actively constructing context for competence. This module will introduce you to some of those strategies to help adapt academics and ensure that all diverse communicators have a means to actively and be meaningfully engaged. It will focus on identifying priority learning goals for activities and how to ensure that those goals can be addressed through means that are both efficient and meaningful. It is entirely possible and necessary to engage with the most complex of academic concepts in ways that support the communication needs, preferences, and priorities of all learners.
My name is Kayla Takeuchi, and I am a non-speaking autistic. I was born in silence. For the first 15 years of my life, I was silent with no way to communicate my most basic needs and wants. I lived a life of frustration and despair, as my parents took me to doctors and specialists who poked me with needles and ran countless tests to see why I was not speaking and why I was throwing tantrums for no apparent reason. At age 4, I was provided a home program with 30 hours a week of one-on-one ABA therapy in a home daycare. I worked with college students trained by a supervisor from an agency outside of my school district. The college students were wonderful and kind and worked with me for about 3 years, but all I really learned was to be able to sit and attend to tasks. I basically learned compliance. I worked on the same things over and over again because my apraxia refused to allow me to show what I knew. The school district sent a speech therapist to my home program, but she was easily frustrated and did not believe I had any intelligence at all. I was fortunate that I was fully included with support in elementary school. I participated in all activities and learned grade-level academics, even though I was unable to communicate what I learned. All I had for communication was the picture exchange system, or PEX, which I used until my second year in high school. At first, PEX was useful for me because I could finally request things and get them. I felt I had some power to communicate, but I was left with no way to have a real conversation with others, and I was unable to fully participate in class. After living in silence for 15 years, my life was transformed when I typed to communicate with my angel, Jana. I first sat down with her on April 3rd, 2007, and that was the day I stepped out of silence and found my voice. I typed for 3 hours that day as my parents, being proper Japanese, sat in silence. That is, until we got in the car for the 3-hour drive home and they expressed their astonishment. From that day on, my life was forever changed. What I really wanted more than anything was a real education with textbooks and to be fully included with my peers. I found a charter high school that supported my typing and believed in my intelligence. I went from being moved around like a piece of furniture to a high school graduate. I received an associate's in arts degree in social sciences, and I am now a history major at Fresno State University. My road to a real education was very challenging, but perseverance has been the key.
In this course, we've learned so much about all the competencies needed to support students' sensory and motor needs as we develop communication skills. It's time to take a look now at how we can support them academically. In this section of the course, we're going to cover 4 main topics.
First, we're going to spend some time talking about the adaptation of academic assignments to make them accessible for students with complex communication needs, while still retaining the integrity of age-appropriate curriculum. This is a hefty topic that we'll begin to dive into, but we obviously can't cover every objective for every subject for every grade level. So instead, we're going to look at strategies and tools that will allow you to adapt any assignment. So please note that we're talking about adapting assignments and not modifying assignments. Modified assignments change or simplify content or expectations for the student's knowledge. So adaptations do not fundamentally alter the curriculum or content. They simply provide alternative ways for students to access the content or demonstrate their knowledge of that content.
We're also going to discuss how to write IEP, individualized education plan goals that make age-appropriate content attainable for students with complex communication needs. We recognize that our course participants come from a variety of professional backgrounds and even different nations. So while this is a fairly US-specific objective in its language, the ideas behind writing measurable goals that align with age-appropriate content is fairly universal. Because we're discussing how to support students' communication needs in educational environments, it's important for us to talk about what that actually looks like in schools. While staffing is ultimately a school-by-school issue, we'll share some considerations about how to sustainably provide supports in different settings.
Finally, we're going to come back to a topic we discussed in our relationship building module. An easy-to-use home-to-school communication system is crucial for building a strong partnership with parents. But it's also important to be able to effectively communicate due dates, assignment locations, what's already been done at school, and what needs to be done at home.
The first step in successfully adapting an academic assignment for students who spell, point, or type to communicate, really for any student, is to ask what the objective of the assignment is. So many times, teachers create beautiful assignments that they think are centered on one task, but they often involve multiple, sometimes unrelated skills. The document you see on your screen right now is an actual student assessment, an exit card, a sort of quiz or mini assessment from a 4th grade social studies class. Let's take a look at what students are asked to do here. The first question requires a long written response. Compare ways that Native American, Pacific Northwest, and Eastern woodland societies used the natural environment to meet their needs for clothing before the establishment of the 13 colonies. Generalize why you think they wore different things. Whew, that is a mouthful, especially for 4th graders. I see some words in a word bank at the bottom. Weather, temperature, natural environment, seasonal. For example, one reason I think I generalize. Okay, wow, I have 2 master's degrees and I have literally never started a sentence, I generalize, in my life. But that's beside my point at the moment. We're here to focus on seeing if this assessment is measuring the stated objective. Oh, right, the stated objective. Did you see it up here at the very top? 3.5.D.1. Explain why and how people adapt and modify the natural environment and the impact of those modifications. Well, okay, writing a paragraph can be one way to explain how and why people may have adapted and modified their natural environments, but is it the only way to explain that you understand that information? The issue with this type of question is that often students who struggle to write, for a variety of reasons, orthopedic impairments, dysgraphia, dyslexia, apraxia, language impairments, just to name a few, they'll have a terribly hard time presenting knowledge they may have, namely how and why Native people adapted to and modified their environments in the format that's required. Many 4th graders struggle to present a clear argument and support it with examples in a paragraph. But remember, this is a social studies assignment, not a language arts assignment. If we look at the bottom of the page, the second question asks students to draw and label the clothing of Native Americans from each of the 2 regions mentioned in the first question. Are we measuring spatial ability, artistic ability, spatial reasoning, hand-eye coordination? In the next few minutes, we'll change this portion of the assessment too, so that it measures students' knowledge of what they learned about Native clothing and not their fine motor skills. Let's think about how else someone could demonstrate mastery of this objective in relation to this assessment. I'm going to show you the same assessment task adapted in 2 different ways, which both show mastery of the stated objective without requiring the demands of composition. Remember, this is a social studies task, not an English language arts task. We're measuring students' knowledge of the topic, not their ability to compose a paragraph. In this particular case, it's important for students to know that Native people in the Eastern Woodland societies made their clothing from animal skins and fur, largely because their climate was cold and they needed to stay warm. The people of the Pacific Northwest, however, made their clothing primarily from cedar bark because it rains a lot in the Pacific Northwest, and the cedar bark hats and capes help them to stay dry. In the first adaptation you see here, it's a fill-in-the-blank assessment. This assessment gives students the sentence frames and allows them to use their own knowledge to fill in the blanks. Let's read through it. Compare ways that Native American, Pacific Northwest, and Eastern Woodland societies used the natural environment to meet their needs for clothing before the establishment of the 13 colonies. Generalize why you think they wore different things. Here's our first sentence. The Native people of the Eastern Woodland societies mainly made their clothing from blank. The purpose of using these materials was to keep the people blank. The climate in their region could be very blank. The Native people of the Pacific Northwest mainly made their clothing from blank. The purpose of using these materials was to keep the people blank. The climate in their region could be very blank. The Native people of the Eastern Woodlands and Pacific Northwest societies wore different types of clothing because blank. So this version of the assessment maintains the integrity of the original assessment question. It reduces the amount of composition a student needs to do and instead focuses on their knowledge. It still leaves things open for students to compose their own answers, but now it's within a framework that can set them up for success. So let's take a look at the bottom question. Now, instead of needing to draw anything, students can view pictures of 2 types of clothing that they've studied, the skins and fur of the Eastern Woodlands and the cedar bark capes and hats of the Pacific Northwest, and simply label each one. So what if a student isn't ready to compose that level of open-ended answers yet, even with the framework of fill-in-the-blank sentences? Can they still show mastery of this social studies objective? Yep, absolutely they can. Let's take a look at the second adaptation I created for this assessment. This version of the assessment uses the exact same structure of fill-in-the-blank version I showed you a minute ago, but it gives choices for each blank. The assessment question remains the same. So let's take a look at how I've structured the response method. The native people of the eastern woodland societies mainly made their clothing from animal skin or cedar bark. And the students can choose. The purpose of using these materials was to keep the people dry or warm. The climate in their region could be very rainy or cold. The native people of the Pacific Northwest societies mainly made their clothing from animal skin or cedar bark. The purpose of using these materials was to keep the people dry or warm. The climate in their region could be very rainy or cold. The native people of the eastern woodlands and Pacific Northwest societies wore different types of clothing because, and here are the choices, they had different resources, their different climates required different types of clothes, they liked different things. So this version of the assessment allows students to make choices in whatever way they are most proficient, pointing to a choice on a whiteboard, spelling the word of their choice, using partner-assisted scanning to indicate yes for their choice. Whatever method of making choices they are most comfortable with can be used here to allow students to demonstrate the same knowledge as other students who are writing more open-ended answers. You'll notice that the second question remains the same, simply attaching a label to the correct image. In the quiz section of this module, you'll be asked to look at an academic objective and create a way to assess a student's knowledge of that objective that does not require them to compose long answers.
Let's take a look at another assignment, this time geared towards older learners.